Welcome. My name is Norma Vasquez, and I'm the president of the Friends of the Poughkeepsie Library District. We have a bookstore in the back of the Borman Road Library, and we have books, 50 cents, $2, a lot of books. For May, we are going to have half price the art books and the science fiction books. I invite you to visit us at Borman Road. Today we have another author. She will read some passages from the books. And her name is Debra Bruno. She is the author of a Hudson Valley Reckoning, Discovering the Forgotten History of Slaveholding in the May Dutchess American Family. She's a journalist whose work has appeared in the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal, and the Atlantic, among many other publications. Right now, she's living in Washington, D.C. If for more information, you can visit her and to her website, www.debrabruno.com. Please help me to welcome Debra Bruno.
Greetings from Washington, D.C. And no, I won't be taking any questions about what life is like in Washington, D.C. right now. Well, thank you for coming out on this rainy kind of spring green Saturdays. I really appreciate your coming to this. And I'm not really reading excerpts from my book, but I am telling the story of my book and how I discovered my Dutch ancestors in the Hudson Valley and who they were, and a little bit about that story. So I hope I intrigue you enough to perhaps pick up a copy of the book here. And, a lot of times people want to talk to me about that. So I'm happy to talk to you about that after my talk as well. So I grew up in the Hudson River Valley town of Athens, which is in Greene County. And hold on, I'm going to move this a little. There we go. In the early 19th and early 20th century, there were a lot of immigrants, Italian, Irish, German immigrants passing through Ellis Island and then coming up the Hudson to work in the ice houses and the mushroom farms and the brickyards. And one of those Italian immigrants was my grandfather, Pasquale Bruno. And he came from Calabria in Italy South around 1919 and went up the river to Hudson because he had a cousin there. And so his cousin sponsored him. So that's how he landed in Athens. And my father is the Italian side. My mother is the Dutch side, but my identity when I was growing up was very much Italian. We had Mass on Sunday, pasta on Easter and Christmas, and, the Italian identity was the strong identity. So I didn't really know that much about my Dutch heritage until I mentioned once to a friend many years ago now, I have this old Dutch family. My ancestor, Lambert van Valkenburg, came to the New World in about 1640. Hold on one second. He came to this New World in about 1642 and lived in first New Amsterdam. He had land around the site of the Empire State Building, and then he moved up to Fort Orange in Albany. And that's all I knew about my Dutch ancestry. And so this friend said to me many years ago, if you have Dutch ancestors that go back that far in the Hudson Valley, they were probably enslavers. And my first reaction was, no, not my family. We were poor. We were farmers. We didn't have large plantations like the plantations I was imagining of the South. And she said, well, just keep looking. So I managed to delay that by a number of years. And when I finally sat down and looked, first I looked through the Van Valkenburg line, since Van Valkenburg was my mother's maiden name, and I didn't find that much. And then I turned to Collier, which does not sound like a Dutch name, but my grandmother's maiden name was Collier, and it was a family that we're not sure if it was Scandinavian, but they intermarried with the Dutch. So they were culturally Dutch. And I went back 5 generations and found the will of Isaac Collier from 1796. And he was my 5 times great-grandfather. And he must have known at the age of 70 that he was nearing the end of his life. He must have been sick. He had 8 surviving children plus grandchildren scattered around Poughkeepsie, which is also in Greene County. And he wanted to make sure they were cared for. His wife, Sarah Van Vechten Collier, there's another good Dutch name, Van Vechten, passed away about 7 years earlier. So his will left nothing to chance. He distributed land, horses, feather beds, and wagons to his sons, daughters, and grandchildren. He delineated where his property lines went and who got his farm implements. He was also, like many of the early Dutch, focused on the divine. So he would say things like, whenever it shall please the Almighty to take me to him. The will goes on for 4 pages and more than 1,700 words. Finally, toward the end of the will, I found the words that changed everything in my head. Detailed like inventory, along with his property line and his cows, were slaves. In a matter-of-fact way, he distributed a male named Sansom to his daughter Hannah, a boy named Will to his son Joel, and a Negro wench named Marie to his granddaughter. The remains of my Negro slaves, male and female, he wrote, should be equally divided, share and share alike. So there's something else that hit me with a gut punch about that moment, besides the share and share alike, which I thought was one of the most dehumanizing things I'd ever heard, was the fact that this was exactly the land that I had grown up on. This is where I was from. So this happened right under my feet, and I didn't know anything about it. So I started looking. And the more I looked, the more enslavers I found. In the 18th century, nearly every one of my Dutch ancestors was an enslaver. I kept finding their names: Hollenbeck, Vandenberg, Van Loon, Hotelling, Bronk. All of them listed slaves as property in their wills. There was a massive fire at the New York State Library in Albany in 1911, which was also housed the New York State Capitol. Many of you probably know this since you're interested in history. And that fire charred a lot of the early 1790 census records, and the 1790 census was the first federal census. So even though it was our first country's official count, it kind of charred the edges of some of the census records, and those edges were where the people, the heads of household, listed their slaves. But I still found them. I found wills, and I found slaves listed by my ancestors in 1800, in 1810. And I started asking people, did you know that Northerners embraced slavery for almost 200 years? And, before that time, I had thought of New York State as the home of the abolitionists. We were the good guys. We fought on the right side of the Civil War. And so my sense of this narrative was starting to change because I really didn't understand that much. And then I wanted to know what had happened to Will and Marie and Sansom, the slaves that my ancestor Isaac Collier had bequeathed. I wanted to find out, and that's when social media was a very big help. I found a site on Facebook called I've Traced My Enslaved Ancestors and Their Owners, and I joined it, and I wrote a post saying I'm a journalist looking for information about slavery in New York. I'm not even sure I said Hudson Valley. And within 24 hours, I had an email from a woman named Eleanor Meyer. Now, I'm one of these people who, I'm not a woo-woo person, but I do believe sometimes moments are handed to you as a gift. And this was one of those moments because Eleanor said, well, I come from enslaved people in Poughkeepsie and New Baltimore. Now, you know the Hudson Valley. You know how rural this area is. So for her to reach out to me within 24 hours and to say, I come from the same area that your ancestors came from was a real needle in the haystack. And it was a wonderful thing. And then we also had something else in common. We grew up knowing next to nothing about slavery in New York. And her family had also told her that there were no slaves in the Hudson Valley, that her family, which came from the Hudson Valley, some of her family came from the South, so that was different. But some of her family came from the Hudson Valley, and her grandmother told her, oh, no, we were not slaves. So she was told a similar whitewashed story that I was. And so her grandmother was a woman, and we consider her the matriarch of the family, named her, no, that wasn't her grandmother. Her was an ancestor named Mary Vanderzee. And so Mary Vanderzee was not born enslaved, but she was born to enslave people. So we have never been able to figure out why Eleanor's grandmother, who must have known this truth, didn't want to tell Eleanor. But what we also found when we started looking is more connections than we ever imagined we would find. One of them was the story of a baby born on a ship called the Rensselaer Wick, which set sail from the Netherlands to the Americas in the fall of 1636. On that boat, a baby was born to Albert Andreasen Bratt and his wife, and they gave that infant a first name because he was born on the boat, and that was called Storm. And when Storm Bratt came to the New World, he took on a new name, Vanderzee, Dutch for from the sea. So that's the origin of the name Vanderzee. Now, it's a little unclear, since we don't have anything in writing from Storm Vanderzee himself, whether he was the one who created that name or whether someone else did. But I loved that story, and Storm Vanderzee was my 9th great-grandfather. Then Eleanor and I, of course, realized that we had the connection of she had enslaved ancestors who took the name Vanderzee, and I had ancestors who took the name Vanderzee. So we started on a project of research. And what we found was there was quite a bit of slavery in the Hudson Valley, and it grew enormously in the 18th century. In 1740, the region of Poughkeepsie and Livingston Manor, which is on this side of the Hudson, which included places like Claremont, counted just 243 people. And out of that number, 53 people were enslaved. So that was 21% of the population. Another stat that I found was in 1786, Poughkeepsie had 2,893 people, white people, and 395 enslaved people. So that was 12% of the population. So these are pretty big numbers. So we kept digging deeper into the stories. One of the stories I found was in my hometown of Athens, which at the time was called Lunenburg. And in Athens, many of the enslaved people were actually baptized at Zion Lutheran Church, which is still there and still an active church today. Their second pastor was a man named Wilhelm Christoph Birkenmeier, and he was one of the founders of Lutheranism in America. He was one of the first really significant Lutheran ministers. And Birkenmeier was very actively baptizing the slaves and the babies of the enslaved people. So I found a note in December 5th, 1725, baptized at our meeting at Lunenburg, 4 weeks old, Hannes Christian, child of Peter Christensen, a baptized Negro, and wife Elizabeth, a German woman. So from 1712 until the end of the 18th century, Zion Church baptized 146 slaves, free blacks, and mixed-race children, teenagers, and adults. That was fascinating to me, but Birkenmeier himself was an enslaver. He owned his own slaves, and baptism did not confer freedom on the enslaved in the church. So even though he was busily welcoming blacks and mixed-race people and slaves into his church, he wasn't necessarily seeing it as a method of conferring freedom. I think he wanted them to be Christian, but he didn't necessarily want them to be free. So slavery in New York lasted for 200 years, close to 200 years, from the 1600s to 1827. In 1799, New York State passed a law that said that any baby born after July 4th, 1799 would be born, quote unquote, free. And that free designation meant that those babies were not totally 100% free. They were born into what I call the twilight period. And what that means is that they were required to serve as indentured servants for the girls until they were 25 and for the boys until they were 28. So they were basically bought and sold as if they were enslaved. So a child could be taken from his or her mother at a very young age, sometimes as young as 3, sometimes as young as 6, when they would think that they would, be able to get some work from them. And then sometimes taken away from their parents and never seen them again. And they'd be stuck for a number of years. And, lifespan at that time was not necessarily hugely long. So by that time, they were well into their life. And I found this record, which, by the way, was collected by FDR himself. FDR was a great collector of New York State history and especially loved Dutch history. So this Poughkeepsie record, it's called the Poughkeepsie Record of Freeborn Slaves, is right here at FDR Library. And one of the most remarkable things about this record is that very few towns, all towns were required to register the birth of these babies born in this twilight period between 1799 and 1827. Poughkeepsie was one of the few places that put it all in a really nice, tidy volume, a bound volume. So you had a list of the enslaver, the baby born, the name of the baby, the name of the mother, the date the baby was born, the date the baby was registered, all there. And in that record, of the 46 enslavers listed, I found 17 of my own direct ancestors. So I then became fascinated by these babies born in the twilight period. So that was wonderful to kind of have that kind of a Rosetta Stone in a sense, because it allowed me to do some research. And I'll mention later a couple of the babies that I found born on that record that I was able to trace their story. But that brings me back to Eleanor. So Eleanor had started to look back into her own family history, and especially to the matriarch of the family, Mary Vanderzee. What was puzzling about Mary Vanderzee was that even though she was born in 1802, so that was exactly within that twilight period, she's not listed on the Poughkeepsie record, even though she was born in the town. So we have a couple of theories about that. Because her parents were listed. She named her parents as two enslaved people named Caesar Egberts and Rebecca Dunbar. And they were enslaved by a man named Conrad Hotelling in New Baltimore, which was the hamlet just north of Poughkeepsie. So how did Mary not show up on this register? Well, we have a couple of theories. One possibility is that Mary's actual mother died in childbirth and Caesar and Rebecca decided to raise Mary themselves. Another possibility is Mary was born not in the twilight period, that she may have been born in 1799 and born enslaved, but somebody decided to, tweak the dates of her birth date so that she could be born in the twilight period. We don't know. Or she could have just changed her name when she got older. There's no Mary born with the right birth date on that record. But we were able to find out a number of things about Mary. She lived to well over 100 years. And so there was an article written by her on her 100th birthday in the New Baltimore newspaper. Her life is a romance. A few years ago, she never tired of telling of the changes she had witnessed. Then the children, I, and the parents would gather around to listen to the tales of long ago, of the soldiers in the War of 1812 passing the farm, her fear of the strange artillery, and of deserters from the army who hid in the barn. Wolves were numerous and fierce. Fire was borrowed from neighbors, and many a bitter morning, Aunt Mary, sometimes accompanied by one of the older children, ran with her heart in her mouth to the frozen brook for water or across to Grandpa's house for fire. It's interesting that article mentions the older children because Mary Vanderzee had 3 or 4 of her children, her first children, when she was 13 and 14 years old before she was married. And those children were said by oral history, according to Eleanor's grandmother, to be light-skinned. So we think that someone in the Hotelling family probably did rape a 13 or 14-year-old Mary Vanderzee. What we do know is Eleanor has done her DNA, and there is Hotelling DNA in her ancestry as well. So that's the theory we have. We, of course, cannot prove that. But I'm also a Hotelling, and of course, I'm a Vanderzee. So Eleanor and I have the link that my ancestors enslaved and probably fathered children with her ancestors. We haven't been able to find a personal DNA connection ourselves, but that's because some of my ancestry back to Hotellings and Vanderzees and Vandenbergs and families like that would be connected goes back far enough that it's harder to trace. But we were able to find that Mary had a number of children. She first had those 3 or 4 children before she was married. Then we had an interesting period of time in which she didn't have children, and then she married a man named John Van Bergen, had a couple more children, and then we don't know what happened to John Van Bergen, but then she married a man named John Vanderzee and had one last child. And then the children from the earlier times took the name Vanderzee to add to the confusion. And for anyone who's ever done genealogy, you know that just makes things a lot more complicated. So, but one of the interesting things we found in our research was that we both had Van Bergen in our family tree. And one of the things I didn't realize until I was able to put some things together is that there's an incredible painting at the Fenimore Art Museum in Cooperstown called the Van Bergen Overmantel. It's in the American Folk Art collection of the museum. And the thing that's remarkable about this painting is that, excuse me, I'm just coming off a little cold, thanks to my grandchildren. I hate when you get that tickle. Sorry. Excuse me, I'm so sorry. This painting is kind of a charming picture of 18th century life in Leeds, which is near Catskill, if you know that area. I'm sorry. And Martin Van Bergen commissioned this painting around 1733. And it's not only one of the earliest known paintings of the Catskills. I kind of cut off when I took a picture of it, but you can see the Catskill Mountains in the back. But it's likely one of the very first paintings that shows slaves on a New York farm. Now, there were some early paintings at the Albany Art and History Institute and New York State Museum, and I think even Schuyler Mansion has some early portraits of slaves with the Schuyler family, but there are almost no pictures of enslaved people going about their day-to-day lives. So this is a significant painting in that sense. And let's see if I can use the arrow. So here's one. That's an enslaved woman. And here's an enslaved person. And here's a Native American person. These are the four Van Bergen daughters. This is one of the Van Bergen sons, I believe. I think this is another one of the Van Bergen sons. And this is Martin Van Bergen and Catherine Van Bergen. So that was remarkable. But then I realized that Mary Vanderzee's first husband was named Van Bergen. So now I'm making a little bit of a leap here, but it is possible, since a lot of the enslaved people took the names of their enslavers, that Eleanor has some ancestry among the slaves in this painting, if the slaves took the name Van Bergen. So I invited her to Cooperstown with her sister and her son to look at the painting more closely, and they were very kind to show it to us. And one of the interesting things is that there's some research, scholars have done some research about some of the people in the painting. The woman on the right-hand side is an enslaved woman wearing white. And then this woman at the bottom is obviously an older woman. And we think that she was a woman named Angalo because Catherine Van Bergen was born in Kingston. She was one of the daughters of a man named DeMeyer, and I'm blanking on his first name, but it was the DeMeyer family of Kingston, which were very wealthy slaveholders. And he gave her in his will as a wedding gift a slave named Angalo. So we think that Catherine brought this older woman, Angalo, to Leeds with her when she married. So that was, oh yeah, here it is. Wilhelmus DeMeyer, who is a wealthy Kingston man. And in his 1705 will, he wrote, "And when my daughter Katrine happens to marry, she shall take with her her negress by the name Angalo." So we were able to give a name to someone, which we found very powerful and very moving. Another family that I spent a great deal of time doing research on is the Bronk family of Cooksaki. The Bronk house, if you've been there, you know this, is considered by many to be one of the oldest in New York. And Judge Leonard Bronk was the only son of John or Jan Bronk, one of the area's biggest enslavers. In the 1790 census, the first national census, he listed 6 slaves. But I was fascinated by one of the other stories from the Bronk family. Leonard Bronk's father had lost his first wife and then married a woman named Susanna Hotelling Bronk after his first wife died. And Susanna Hotelling came to the marriage with her own wealth because the Hotelling family was quite wealthy. And that couple had no children. So when her husband died in 1794, Susanna bought a separate farm nearby and lived there with an increasing number of slaves, a woman named Sarah, who was likely given to her by her father, Sarah's sons Pomp and Jacob, a woman named Maria, and another enslaved woman named Phyllis, whom she had purchased in 1806. But then as Susanna gets to the end of her life, she does something really interesting. She writes a will in 1809, and she says, "It is my will and desire that I do hereby manumit and give freedom to my slaves Sarah, Jacob, Pomp, Maria, and Phyllis, respectively, at the time of my decease." And then to Sarah, she gave 55 acres of land and the entire farm that she was living on, which was extremely unusual. People sometimes did manumit people at their death, but to give them a huge amount of property was remarkable. And I haven't found that kind of, I kind of want to call it generosity, although she wasn't necessarily manumitting them before she died. She was waiting until she was dead, which is similar to what a lot of enslavers, including, of course, George Washington, did. But it was still notable because it wasn't that common. She gave them so much. She gave them bedding, clothing, furniture, soap, candles, horses, pigs, cows, oxen, sheep. And nothing went to her stepson, Leonard, which I thought was also interesting. So she didn't die in 1809. She lived for another 5 years, but it was almost as if she was trying to write a little insurance policy. So in 1814, just before her death, she bought an enslaved woman named Mary from her stepson, Leonard. So she bought this woman, and then the day after she bought her, she put Mary in her will and said, "She's also emancipated after my death." So it sounds to me like she knew she was dying, and she bought this woman just to emancipate her. Now, the sad part is that Sarah, the older slave, didn't show up in this second part of the will. So Sarah had died in the intervening years. So Sarah ended her life enslaved. So, in some ways, this was an act of generosity, but it was also notable that Susanna had no children of her own. She had no biological children. So she had no children to be able to say, this is our inheritance. So she could be generous for that in that sense. So I thought that really, in a lot of ways, to me, was very representative of what was going on with slavery in New York. On the surface, it seemed more benign and more gentle and more limited than slavery in other parts of the country. But if you dug a little bit deeper, you found stories of both cruelty and generosity and a lot of complexity. And I found that in a number of different places. Slavery was slavery. There's no getting around the fact that not having freedom of your body, not having freedom of movement is slavery. But it was an interesting and complicated slavery that I still haven't quite figured out. And of course, every story is different. As slavery began to be phased out, there were a lot of people who decided that they would self-emancipate. So as the end of slavery came in the early 19th century, more and more enslaved people started to run away. And I loved collecting and reading about runaway slave advertisements because it told you so much about who the people were who were running, what they were doing, how old they were, what their chances were, that sort of thing. And I kept thinking about this one advertisement I found in 1811, and it stuck out to me for a couple of reasons. One, because it was toward the end of slavery in New York. 1811 was in the last, 10 to 20 years of slavery. But also the young man who ran in the dead of winter. He ran in February. So it was cold. Most people I would think would run when the weather was warm and maybe they could use fields and things to hide. So this young man, 16-year-old named Jim, also stood out because when he ran, the advertisement said he stole a lion skin coat and boots that were too big for him. So I just fell down a rabbit hole. I had to find out, was the river frozen in February of 1811? And the Hudson had frozen at that point. And it was a winter. It was a month of great snow, apparently, too. So now I had this vivid image of Jim clomping down the Hudson, perhaps, in his big boots and his lion skin coat. But then it became even more powerful for me when I realized I knew the house in Athens where he had run from. I did a little digging. It's too boring for me to go into sort of how I figured out which house it was. But this was a house that was owned by a man named Abraham Van Buskirk. And I jog by that house every time I'm in Athens. And every time I just never realized it. And then when you look at the house, you can really visualize it because the entrance of the house is on the second floor. So here I was picturing the Van Buskirk family sitting around the fire on a cold winter night on the higher floor, and Jim just walking out the door at the bottom and just walking right down to the Hudson. So, I could picture that. And actually, very, very recently, the man who owned the house, who is now restoring it, gave me a little tour of the house, and he showed me the downstairs. And there are huge fireplaces downstairs. I could really picture Jim being down there and deciding to leave. So it made slavery all that more real to me. And, something that had been in the beginning kind of an abstraction really, really did change in my mind in a lot of ways. At the end of, after slavery and after, through the 19th century, many Black families did stay in the Hudson Valley, and they found work. A number of other Black families worked on the Erie Canal. A lot of Black men got jobs working in the Erie Canal. Many more moved down to New York City. One of the things that also happened is as the more recent immigrants came into the Hudson Valley, they took those jobs that, had been traditionally taken by Black people. And so you'd have more Irish and Italian immigrants taking the kind of the working level jobs. But I also became fascinated to learn a little bit more about the Civil War and the number of Black soldiers from Greene County in particular, which is what I focused on, but also Dutchess County and Ulster County and every, county in the Hudson Valley. A lot of the Black soldiers who fought for the Hudson Valley, for the Union in the Civil War, had Dutch last names. So it was fascinating because even though they were fighting in the colored troops, you knew that they were descended from the Dutch enslaved. And then I found one of the most powerful pieces of evidence that really I found very poignant and very emotional. And let's see if I can quickly find that. Trying to preserve my voice here. There is a young man who was the very last young baby born on the Poughkeepsie Register of Freeborn Slaves. And he was born on May 27th, 1826. So just a year over the end of the Twilight period. So this baby, who was listed in the Poughkeepsie Register as Harry, and then went on to take the name Henry, was born to Leonard Bronk's slave Mary. And so I found him in the records of the Civil War because he was from Greene County. And he probably served 21 years as an indentured servant, even though he was born in 1826. And then I found a man named Private Henry Bronk of Company C in the 20th United States Colored Infantry Regiment. He would have been about 42 when he enlisted, so he was on the older end for soldiers. But he was either wounded or he picked up a disease. And this is where I always cry. But he died in a hospital outside of New Orleans on July 16th, 1865. So the Civil War had been over for months, but the last freeborn slave died, for his country. So I can't tell that story without getting choked up. So every time I find another piece of evidence, I realize how important it is to put together these parts of the puzzle. Even today, I still fall down rabbit holes of research. One of the best parts of this journey has been the connections that I've made with the Eleanor Meyer and the entire Vanderzee family. So let's see. That's Eleanor. That's her son Jake. That's her sister Beverly. There's me, my mom, my sister, And all of the other people are descendants from Thomas Vanderzee, who was Mary Vanderzee's oldest son. Thomas Vanderzee was a well-known man on the Hudson. He was a boatman on the Hudson, lived in both Poughkeepsie and Kingston. And there are a number of articles in the Daily Freeman that were written about him over the years. So he was a fascinating man in himself. And there's some great stories in my book about Thomas Vanderzee. But I find it really powerful to be able to have connected with the people that I call the Vanderzee diaspora, you know, the people who have descended from someone who came from such a legacy. And to me, it means a lot. It means that her story, Mary Vanderzee's story, and her descendants live on. One of the descendants of Mary Vanderzee was a man named James Vanderzee, who was a Harlem Renaissance photographer, and was really had made his name, in sort of defining what the Harlem of the 1920s looked like. So there have been some incredible sort of stories that have come out of this family, but a lot of it still hadn't been told. And so it felt important to me to tell that story. And I used this quote from Toni Morrison as sort of my guiding principle when I was writing the book. If you're really alert, then you see the life that exists beyond the life that is on top. And to me, that's been my goal, to find that hidden life. And I felt it was my responsibility to tell that story. And, I'm anticipating a possible question that you might have. The lesson here isn't guilt, it's knowledge. Our inheritance as Americans is to understand our true history. And I think that that's very important. And I'd love to hear your questions, because I hope you ask me some very hard questions. And thank you so much for listening. And apologies for coughing and crying and all that other stuff. No questions at all?
In your research and tracing of the family, have you seen anything that would impinge on the question of reparations?
Impinge?
Or at least
I feel my book is a reparation, in a lot of ways, because I'm trying to repair some history. I think you're trying to ask me about reparations. Yes? I think there should be some form of reparations. I think we've done a lot of things wrong in this country. I'm very proud to be American. I love my country, but we've done a bunch of things wrong. And, the fact that when slaveholders in 1799 were told by New York State, we're going to pay you to raise the babies that were born to your enslaved women. We're going to give you some money to help raise them. So they got payment, so can we do something? It's probably not up to me to figure out what that is, but I know, for example, one of the nice things that's been happening, and it's happened in the North. It started in Connecticut, but it's also happening now more in New York State, is something called the Witness Stones Project, where there are a number of historic sites that have a placard that marks that an enslaved person lived there and tells a little bit about their story. And I think it would intrigue children to learn more about who was this person, who lived here. So I think that's also a form of reparation. I know New York State is also has a reparations commission. What happens to that now, I'm not sure, but I know that Governor Hochul has instituted that. So I think they're supposed to come out with a report in a few years with recommendations for reparations. But I think that we do have to figure out ways to kind of make it right. I live in a neighborhood in Washington, D.C. that was redlined. Black people were not allowed to buy houses in my neighborhood, and I didn't know that when I bought my house, but I think there are a lot of things that we are just now learning that we haven't learned. So if a form of reparation is to expand our knowledge, I think it's not a bad place to start. Some people might accuse me of sort of avoiding the question by answering that way, but I think that there are lots of ways of, I don't want to say skinning the cat because I love cats, but there are lots of ways of fixing problems that of having a better understanding and correcting some historic wrongs And, you know, maybe there aren't ways to fix some of these things, but, you know, I think that we should at least try to make an attempt. Does that answer the question?
Is yours necessary? Is research such as yours necessary to trace who gets what or who is entitled to what?
I think research such as mine is, I think these stories would not have been told. And I think Mary Vanderzee would be just shocked to think that she might be on the cover of a book. But I think it's, you mean to trace back who was descended from slaves? Yeah, I think it's important. I think that a lot of people are doing a lot of great genealogy work to sort of figure out who they are. But I think that it's not, is it necessary? Yeah, I mean, I think this kind of research is necessary. I don't know if I want to make it into an equation. Is that what you're sort of asking me? Yeah, I don't know. Yeah, possibly. You know, yeah, I mean, so you're talking about people who are not necessarily descended from enslaved in the United States. Yeah. This is, I was told there'd be no math on this test. No, no, I honestly, I see what you're saying. And I think that's the problem. It does get extremely muddy. Even people who are not descended, Black people who are not descended from enslaved have still faced forms of racism. And so there are those things too. So if you're saying, does A have to lead directly to B in that direct way? I think that's only one way to get at how you would understand fixing a historic wrong. That's a tough one.
And to your knowledge, the escaped slaves, were they heading in any particular direction? Were there any other states that were free by that time?
Yeah, Massachusetts, sometimes people would, I found some records. There's a great diary by a Scottish doctor named Alexander Coventry who talked about a man from, I think it was Claverick or Hudson area, who escaped from there over to Massachusetts because Blacks were free in Massachusetts. So some people did try to escape east. Some people went north to Canada, and some people went south to New York City because they could blend in a little bit more with the larger population. You know, so it was kind of a mixture of what happened. And some people escaped and then didn't make it, got caught back, you know. So this Van Buskirk story that I told you, Abraham Van Buskirk has a free Black man living with him a few years after this 1811 so-called escape. And I always wondered, did Jim manage to get caught and come back but work for him as a free man? You know, it's one of those mysteries I wish I could know, because after slavery, of course, a lot of the enslaved didn't really have a way to figure out where were they going to go, what were they going to do, where are they going to work. So they ended up working on the same farms where they had been enslaved and working for the same people who had enslaved them. You know, in some because that was their life, in some there was some affection for their enslavers, and some because they just didn't have any other choices. So it's a very complicated story, but yeah, they went in multiple directions. Some of them went west because you could get to Canada more easily through like Niagara Falls and, you know, up that way.
Good afternoon. What resources did you use to help you learn about New Netherland and colonial New York?
I used a number of different resources. I used Vedder Research Library in Poughkeepsie, which has some incredible archives, and especially the handwritten letters of Leonard Bronx. So the archivist there actually let me go in the back, and I lost hours just paging through. I was reading about the American Revolution in real time, and it was the most fascinating thing. That if I have another 20 years, I'll go back and just read that, because you hear people saying, we're out of butter, please send butter, you know, things like that. So Vedder Research Library in Poughkeepsie was one of my great sources. Ancestry.com was great because you have all this digitized, you have wills, you have census records. It's kind of all there in one-stop shopping if you're extremely careful not to pick up on fallacies that get repeated and repeated. So sometimes, and anyone who's done genealogical research knows that if somebody gets something wrong and then 5 other people repeat it, it takes on this sort of patina of being real, even if it's not. So you have to be extremely careful. Is there a document that backs that up? You know, is there a will? Is there a census record? Is there a letter? Is there a newspaper article? And then I went to New York State Library, and that had also given me a number of great resources. And then, you know, there's a man named Charlie Gehring who has been at the New Netherlands Institute in Albany for a number of years. He's just retired, and he spent his entire career translating the Dutch records into English. And not only did he do that, but he was just a wonderful resource in terms of making recommendations. He was the one who pointed out the Alexander Coventry diary to me, for example. So it was a combination of actual on-the-ground research and online research, but it's kind of ongoing too. So nobody's asking me about guilt.
Thanks. I don't actually know what my question is yet, but I will say that my name is Debra Castellano. I have very similar Italian immigrant and Slovak on my dad's side, and going way back to the revolution on my mom's side. So I've always been super curious. I live in Chatham now. I grew up in California, but the family's originally from Florida. So
well, Florida.
I don't know where I would, and in fact, a tobacco farm. So
Yeah,
pretty
well,
much, you know.
yeah.
And so,
Well, one thing I can say is interesting. I had a conversation with a woman recently, since I live in DC, whose family is from the South, and she said, and it's funny because even Southerners, I think, are starting to have a little bit of a reckoning about their ancestry, because they always imagined, when you see these fantastically large plantations, that was where slavery was, and only there. And it wasn't true. I mean, a lot of the very small farmers also had slaves. And one of the things I found in my book, there's a chapter on the Southern Van Valkenburgs. So one of my ancestors, his wife had tuberculosis, so he moved to Macon, Georgia in the 1850s, and with his entire family to Macon, Georgia. And he was also an entrepreneur, and Macon was a booming, industrializing town at the time. And so I think it was both a kind of a financial decision, but also hoping to save the life of his wife. His wife passed away and he remarried, but he had a large family in Macon. And as the Civil War approached, several of them signed up to fight for the Confederacy. What was interesting, what I found, was that there was a mythology that one of the sons, whose name was James Dunbar von Valkenburg II, was anti-slavery and yet had fought for the Confederacy. So that sent me down a fascinating rabbit hole. How could you be anti-slavery and fight for the Confederacy? Turned out not to be true. What was true was that his father, who was also named James Dunbar von Valkenburg, was a fervent abolitionist in Macon, Georgia. So that I would love to know more about the father, but the son owned slaves. He and his wife had enslaved and fought for the Confederacy, was killed at Monocacy, and was killed by a sharpshooter from the north at Monocacy. And I went to Macon and I saw his gravesite, and I saw a portrait of him at the Cannonball House Museum in Macon, Georgia. So what was interesting to me about that story was that there was a story told that somehow this Van Valkenburg branch of the family were against slavery, but still good sons of the South. And it wasn't exactly true. It was more complicated than that. So I think that's probably the bottom line of my book. It's more complicated than you think.
well, before I pass this out, I'm proud to say that I do have an ancestor who fought for the North
Okay.
in the Civil War.
Well, I have both. I did then pay my respects to Monroe Van Valkenburg, who was another distant cousin who also died. He's buried at the Soldiers Home Cemetery outside of Washington, very near Lincoln's summer cottage. And there, I like to imagine that maybe President Lincoln saw his grave and paid his respects at his grave. So I've got the kind of the nice balance of the two Van Valkenburgs, both killed in the Civil War, but for different sides. So that was a very American story.
I may be the last. I have a supportive and appreciative comment rather than a question. I was present in the large marquee that was erected at Claremont for your presentation,
Oh, when it was raining cats and dogs that day?
Raining Cats
Oh
and
my
Dogs.
gosh.
And
You
the-
get extra bonus points.
the venue was ample, but unfortunately they didn't have a videographer to capture
No.
your presentation with your co-presenter.
Yes.
So I would like to commend
Thank you.
to your attention that now, because you've come back for another presentation at this Presidential Library and Center, there is a recording, and I would commend it to your broader list.
Thank you. And tomorrow, Eleanor and I are speaking at Irvington Public Library, Irvington Historical Society at 2 p.m., which is on 100 Main Street in Irvington. So if you want to hear the Eleanor and Debbie version of this story, you can come tomorrow at 2. If you're not sick to death of me.
Here on short notice, ask them to call in. They're something a little more than just holding an iPhone in hand. Call in somebody to make
There's going to be a film. The Irvington people are making a film.
Excellent.
Thank you.
So glad to hear it.
Thank you. Some places don't allow comments. I was at a talk recently, not my talk, but a woman stood up and said, I don't have a question, and ripped the microphone from her hand. So I appreciate you
That's
allowing
never
that.
been done here. Well, how about a round of applause for
Thank
Debra
you.
Bruno?
Thank you so much.
And please join us out in the lobby for a book signing. And thanks for coming today.